Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Today we have an extremely special guest. I'm very excited. It's her first podcast ever, so we'll make it nice and easy, but I am very pleased to introduce Sarah Keller. She is a junior researcher specializing in sustainability perspectives in science and society at the University of Zurich, Switzerland. Dedicated to addressing environmental, social, and economic challenges, she applies an interdisciplinary approach to sustainability. Her work bridges academic research and practical applications, emphasizing collaboration, innovation, and the integration of scientific knowledge into public policy and societal practices. How are you doing today?
Hi, thank you so much for having me here, Gautam. I'm very looking forward to this discussion and just reminiscing on the time that we spent together at Kaleido in the mountains. That was pretty special experience. So yes, thank you for inviting me.
No, of course. I still remember when we first met, you were telling me a lot about anthropology, and I was very fascinated to just hear so much more. One, what is anthropology, and how did you find your interest in it?
Okay, so anthropology is the study of human sociocultural contexts. So it's a very broad kind of interest in culture in general. The discipline kind of developed in an interest in more exotic cultures at the beginning of the discipline's development. Um, but it shares a lot of related areas with sociology as well. So anthropology today exists in all kinds of human contexts. You can do anthropology of law, you can explore kind of institutional, systemic, and cultural contexts of organizations, people living in different countries. And so it's a very broad area that you can then choose to specialize in different ways. And my interest in anthropology was born because I grew up living in a lot of different cultural contexts. So from the ages of 10 to 15, I traveled the world with my mom, living in countries like Mexico, Thailand, the Philippines, Seychelles, and some more. And I was living a lot with local people, doing whatever that they were doing. And I wasn't realizing, but that was kind of a pre-training in anthropology because one of the key methods is participant observation. So you learn about how people live and express their culture and the dynamics in it by participating in whatever they're doing and learning through doing and being with people and not just from the outside.
Mhm.
So that's how kind of I got to anthropology at the
Wow.
University of Zurich. But before that, I was actually doing an apprenticeship, a commercial apprenticeship with an impact investment firm. So that's kind of how I started working in the area of sustainability the prior to my studies.
Hmm. This idea of traveling early in your educational experience is something I've always thought about and dabbled with. One, was your mom traveling mainly just for was it for work, or did she want to just expose you to the world? What was kind of the incentive behind the moves for those 5 years?
I think, implicitly probably wanted to show me the world as well. I mean, she was already traveling a lot before I was born and was exposed to different kind of cultural and religious contexts. So I think she just was at a point in her life where she really wanted to get out and she just kind of took me along. And I always say, I don't know, this might be interesting for your podcast because it's called Re-Educated. And I think the funny thing with me is that I didn't go to school during that time. And the idea was that I was going to be homeschooled, but we somehow didn't really find the right system. So I think I got a bit of a school of life. And then had to learn also to reintegrate myself into the educational system. So, yes.
There is so much to get into here. I'm actually so excited because I've been talking to a few parents who've been thrown around this type of idea of wanting to take their kids out of the system, show them parts of the world to understand humans and people and the different things that people go through. And one of the things that I've seen happen for some students and not others is this feeling of disconnection whenever they return back to whatever they call home. What was that experience like for you when you were done at 15 and you went back? Did you go back to Switzerland? And if you did you feel disconnected from those around you who might have always stayed in the same place and went to school and kind of got used to that routine? What was that reintegration like for you?
Yeah, it was definitely rocky, I would say. I think one of the key things in thinking about education in young people is that education is socialization. Basically, you socialize children into different contexts, right, and values and ways of living, and usually they're anchored with wherever you are. And so, I think that not going to school socialized me in a very different way. I was very adaptable in terms like that. So when I came back to Switzerland, my main challenge was that I was culturally so differently socialized that kids my age had a very hard time kind of placing me. I was really uh, a little bit of an outsider. Just, even just like my facial mimics or the way I would react and share in class. I remember we were had some geography class, and I remember getting really excited and passionate about a topic because I was relating it to some kind of experience and I was sharing that very openly. And, I don't know if it's also the Swiss context. And, I went to high school then when I came back, more like in a village setting outside of Zurich. So it was a little bit less international. And I remember that that created a little bit of I ruffled some feathers, I would say, along the way, just for doing things a little bit more differently. But I am Swiss, so I do have that side in me as well. I can also be more reserved or shy. So, yeah.
Mhm. So, if when you think back to those 5 years, if you could give that opportunity again for somebody else, if you were to have your own students or children or whatever it was, and you were to take them on that journey of those 5 years, is there anything you would have done differently? And what are the things you would have done the same?
Good question. I think I would have balanced a bit more um, the amount of moves that we did. I think that um, as a child, you do need some sense of stability and structure. And I think that those periods of time when we stayed in certain places, 3 to 4 months, I think it would have been probably better if it was like more like a year, like a yearly cycle. That's what I would kind of do differently, just because it does take time also to build relationships. And ultimately, that's how people learn and grow. So that's, I think, the only thing that I would do differently. And I think the rest, like the diversity of places, is definitely interesting and something I would do again.
Hmm. Because you said you had mentioned one, I really like that point on this time because I think that it plays a huge difference. Even in my own travels now, I usually try to stay for the 90 days that the visa allows for. But and to me that seems like a decently long time, but I have a lot of friends who travel, 5 or 6 days or seven, 7 days per place and I was traveling like that this month and it was so exhausting and I didn't actually ever really feel grounded. But I think there are certain lessons that come from that type of moving. But what you're talking about, that socialization, getting to make community, which are all very important parts of a life, and learning how to do that is really essential. But moving all the time in these rapid amounts of time makes that really difficult. And so
Yeah.
you talked a bit about getting homeschooled and not really, so were you reading a lot? What was the type of learning that you were doing? Which is, it's so broad when you're just in the world and you allow the world to teach you.
Yeah, I mean, I think my form of learning was not necessarily through textbooks. So I wasn't necessarily guided to read certain things. I had a lot of freedom. Um, I had a laptop pretty young, So I think I was 12 when I got my own laptop. And so I did a lot of learning through surfing the internet. And also, I did like to go to libraries as well. But so my learning was more niche interest oriented and not necessarily like a basic education, like everyone, goes through these things. I think it was more like nurturing my personal interests. Um, but I think another big part was that because I was out and about, um, living with the locals, I learned to speak Spanish and Italian and French fluent from an early
Wow.
age. And English, I taught myself when I was around 8 years old. And I was really, really fluent in English, also, again, through the internet. And I think that the languages that I learned so naturally, they actually gave me access to learning from other people through conversations and just having access to that. So I think that that definitely helped to keep me kind of anchored. Because if you have a language barrier, it's going to limit the kind of conversations that you can have and the kind of connections that you can have when you're traveling in places.
So how many languages can you speak?
I speak 5 languages,
Wow.
mainly the European, Spanish,
But
Italian,
still, French, English, and then what's the fifth one?
um, Spanish, Italian, German, German?
Yeah, German, French, and English.
Yeah,
Wow, that's fascinating. That allows you to travel to most of the world. There's just
pretty
a few
much.
countries.
Pretty much. And otherwise, you just kind of, use your body.
Yeah.
Talk.
Yeah, wow. I mean, I'm trying to figure out what perspectives that form of traveling, because not only those 5 years were really special, one, because you weren't in school at all. And so all the learning was fully on your control and what you wanted to learn and your own interests that drove you to learn. What do you feel like were the motivations at that age to learn? Why were you surfing the internet? Like, did you have any desire to learn?
That's a good question. I I think that I was very curious child. I think I was very courageous. I think that's something that really pushed me out into like exploring the world. And when I came back to Switzerland and I was reintegrated in school, the teachers really loved me because I was just so eager to learn and I loved going to school. I saw it as a privilege, because I didn't go to school for a long time. And so yeah, I think that I was hungry for learning, although I might not always have had the opportunity to explore it um, further. Yeah.
Hmm.
I had a lot of
It's
time
fast.
on my hands. Like
Hmm.
kids here, they go to school 5 days a week, and so it does fill up your schedule.
I think to when I think to my early childhood education experiences, it was, I lived in the same city for 18 years. I knew exactly where the schools are from the time I was born. I used to bike to school and I would come home, finish the homework. It was kind of the same routine that I had every day. And so for a long time, I yearned to understand what the rest of the world was like. What were other people's lives like? And so I feel like I'm living out those dreams now. But because of that, I'm always cynical of what the kind of typical schooling system is. But for you, where you had the other opportunity, where you had the kind of freedom to explore early, what were some of those things that you really liked about the traditional school and the building and the homework that you felt like was really helpful? That maybe people who are forced into that don't, maybe are not able to see that perspective.
Hmm. I think I really valued the social component of school. I think I really appreciated the role of teachers that teachers have in guiding students in their growth, not only into their intellectual growth, but also as, characters and young adults in development. Um, and the care they put in that and the commitment. So I like that aspect of school that just kind of keeps you embedded. And then I think this in the Swiss education system, what I really appreciated was the emphasis that was put on sports and physical activity. I think that's something that's maybe sometimes also forgotten, that it's also part of school. It's like movement and group activities and different excursions and things like that. So I like that component of school as well. And then in terms of the content of the curriculum, I think, yeah, it was great, of course. The Swiss education system, public schools are great. Um, I did like that we had like a class in kind of like religion and culture and just like other perspectives, but I think that that component could have been a little bit bigger. And I'm hoping that in the future, the diversity of culture and global religions and different philosophical life philosophies are also kind of embedded in the earlier education, just so that they're not just seen as this like little add-on that maybe you can choose. I think it's important to have an understanding of the diversity of the world.
Hmm. It's interesting because so in the States, for example, you finish your 18 years up until high school. And often for the people who are interested in going to higher ed, they usually take at max maybe a year away from school. And then most kids, by the time they're 18 or 19, enter the university. But I think what ends up happening is one, you don't really know why you're there. And so I think it brings up this entire party culture that exists in the colleges in the United States where a lot of people are just like, okay, I'm here. I finally have freedom. I get to be around all these young people as well. And so what do I do?
Hmm.
But you took some time, you didn't go directly to university. And so after finishing, you started working and you did your apprenticeship and then you eventually went to university in your mid 20s. What was that experience like? And are you appreciative that you didn't go to university straight out? Or what do you feel about that?
Thank you for asking that question. I think I really appreciated the way you're digging into people's biographies and, finding these transitions. It's really great. So yeah, after I finished my apprenticeship, continued working there. I was hired to work in transaction management. I was working for the region of Africa. It was super exciting time for me because I got to travel sometimes for work as well. And it was my first, like full-time position. And I was like 19 or 20. And so I worked there for a couple of years. And I didn't know yet what I would want to study. It was really just completely open. I was just really grateful to be working in an organization that I liked, that I was learning from. And so I just used that time to kind of, grind a little bit. Um, and then I think um, that gave me a little time to explore my own interests and just, have a structured life and things like that. And then just through conversations and friends, close friends that I made that shared more about their interests, I started realizing that actually I do want to do something with social sciences. And then originally I was thinking about psychology or anthropology. And in the end, I chose anthropology because I felt like it was more of a continued, like broad education. I felt like it was really teaching me about the world more generally. And of course, it was a little bit, I was maybe sometimes a little bit insecure that I was a little bit older, but I think the fact that I had work experience and that I knew that I could just anytime continue working gave me the calm to choose a field of study that I'm actually really interested in, and not because it leads me to a specific job. And I think that that is one of my core learnings and why I appreciate the Swiss educational system and how they've really systematically developed a high quality of applied, yeah, apprenticeship work, is that it gives you this stable footing in the work industry. And then from that, you can then later, you know, explore your interests and decide what your path is, and not because you're because you're driven by the financial need to, make a living.
Mm.
So I think, yeah, most people go straight to studies and then they get out and they have to find a job and they don't know how that's going to be like, um, unless they've already worked before. So I think that that is a good way to go, unless you really know what you want to do.
Wow, this perspective is actually so interesting. It's been coming up a lot in things that we've been reading or talking about, which is the transformation of American universities into these like vocational training centers where you go to learn how to do a job and then you go get a job. And it has the same outcomes that you would expect, which is people really have, they're like, why do I need to learn history? Why do I need to learn all these other, like general ed topics they call them? Like, why take any of those classes? I just need these classes to go get the job. I don't really care about all the other things. But the perspective that you shared, I find to be so interesting because it's like, if you know that you have a job waiting for you regardless, and you already have the skills that you've developed through your apprenticeship program to be able to do that job, you're no longer going to the university with this like dependency. I need a job after this. If this degree doesn't give me a job, I'm screwed. And so you're able to actually take the time to make your learning so much more generalized. You can study philosophy and mathematics and you can develop yourself in such a way that you don't have to run behind the fear of like, okay, if I don't nail these things, I'm not going to get a job, which for so many people in college, that does happen. And it takes away from the broadness of learning as it should be. So do you feel like that was your experience where you had the ability to kind of be a little bit more relaxed and intentional about the way you learned at university?
Definitely, definitely. I wasn't so career focused. I mean, I was also, of course, to some point, visualizing what kind of work I could do that was related to anthropology. That was definitely like a part of it, like applied projects and things like that. But I think I saw it more as something that I did for myself. I wasn't doing this so that I had a job. I was doing this for myself so that I could continue learning about who I am and what I'm good at or what I'm interested in. And I think ultimately one of the learnings that I've done is that this idea of a linear development is something that we're so stuck in. This idea that we go from A to B to C and that there's this like incremental growth that happens. But life is so different in practice, and we really don't know what we're going to discover and where we want to go. And sometimes we think something is for us and we go after it. And then when we're there, we realize we're unhappy. So, um, so yeah, so I think that even people that, might have from the outside, a very linear approach and go straight to the goal that they wanted to do, um, once they're there for a few years, they might want to change again. So I think I see life and like education and career development as being part of multiple stages. And I think in the end, it's the quality of the learning that you do that's more important than the idea of achieving a certain outcome.
Hmm. This is actually exactly what we were talking about yesterday with Tamar, and that episode was amazing. We talked a lot about uncertainty. And so I'm curious when you talk about this linear and how you apply it into your own life. Because in the path of progress or learning, there are these times where you do fall back or your growth is not at the same level that you thought you were, or you might have been even growing in a way that you actually don't want to be growing in. And it's anything can really happen in the process. And so how have you given yourself the grace to allow the journey to take you wherever, whether it was where you thought it was going to take you or not?
Wow, that's such a good question. How did I find the grace to allow myself to go through these different life phases? Um, hmm. I think one thing, I think I've always struggled with it, to be honest. I don't think that this is easy at all. I've always felt like I want to be already there and I want to be already be doing that, and why ain't I there? Um, But I think one of the learnings that I've done is that the people I work with is more important than what I'm doing. That came to me through an experience where I worked in a context that sounded really good on paper, that, looked like it could give me good opportunities, but I realized that I wasn't really enjoying kind of the social dynamic of the place I was working in. So now my approach to choosing career opportunities or growth, it's a bit more people oriented in the end, and realizing that I will always be working with many different kinds of people. Um, and then also the natural kind of like when you look at the things that you've been doing so far, um, I think what's difficult is finding a balance between that natural kind of um, flow of the direction that you're already going in. So, how work opportunities or they emerge from past relationships and past opportunities and they kind of like recreate each other. And I think that is something that's a question mark for me is how do I find the middle way that is definitely based on what I did before, but slowly, slowly also gearing me more towards what I want to do.
Hmm. Before I get into asking you what it is that you want to do, I'm very curious because I think you laid it out very beautifully when you talked about the people I work with is more important than the work that I do. I think that's a very unique and refreshing perspective. For I'm curious for you, what do you feel like defines a work environment or the dynamics between the people in a work environment that you enjoy being in? What are some of the traits or qualities of a place where you're like, I like how I feel here?
Hmm. I think I like a work environment that has hired a diversity of people where I can
Mm,
tell HR was really making their decisions with their gut. They were getting to know people, they were looking at their experience, their professional skills and whatever, but it feels like the sorting mechanism feels like organic in some way. And I think that's refreshing because then you're surrounded by the people with different life experiences and who maybe themselves have gone through different career developments and were still, invited to come and work in a certain environment. So I think, yeah, definitely the diversity of people that are there. I definitely appreciate an international context. I like it when there's people with different cultural backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds, that are, yeah, working on the same topic. And then of course, like a bit more like a family, like, it sounds a bit catchy maybe, but like a family approach or like just that it's not too cold, that the environment is not too stuffed, like that people are trying to prove their worth and their intelligence continually in the way they work. I think that can create a little bit of a unhealthy work environment. So yeah, I think just a sense of contentment with how people are. And then of course I really appreciate people that are very driven, mission driven, and good leadership. But yeah, these are all very when I talk about them like that, abstract ideas that in practice show themselves in different ways.
Do you feel like the place you're working at right now embodies a lot of these?
I've just started working in this kind of area, and so I'm still getting to know the organization and how the different teams are working together. But I'm happy with the kind of work environment that's in right now.
You talked earlier a little bit about moving towards the type of work that you want to be doing. What does that look like? What is the type of work that you want to be doing?
Yeah, that's a question that I'm actually exploring myself, that I don't really have a clear answer to. But I think right now I'm at a point where I could see myself working in a startup environment, uh, building something together. I really feel motivated to do this, kind of like really hands-on teamwork where people are have different roles, and where there's a growth opportunity and the flexibility in terms of what your role can be. And I want to work in a startup environment with the average age being a bit younger. I think that would be something new for me as well, to see how I would move in these kind of environments. And also because I'm eager to learn a little bit more about like innovation or different kinds of work cultures, and how they are organized.
Hmm. I want to now pivot a little bit to sustainability because I think this is definitely a space that I, over the years, have learned I am very unprepared to talk about, but slowly learning and I'm excited to develop my ideas and thinking to also take into account sustainability and thinking about that when it comes to education. So, for you, where did your interest or fascination with sustainability start from? And I'm so curious what that journey has been like since then.
So I was kind of very by coincidence, I came into this area. I think the area of sustainability has really grown a lot in the last 10 years, probably, in so many different ways. The discourse of sustainability is finding application in all industries, and everyone is talking about it in different ways, right? So for me, I was introduced into the topic of sustainability when I started working at Responsibility Investments, which is this impact investment firm. And so they were looking at sustainability from a kind of investment perspective. How can you use money that people are kind of sitting on to be doing work, to make the money work in different ways? So making investments in different kind of developing countries where you can contribute to the growth of those economies in sustainable ways, and being interested in understanding how to do that. And so that made me learn about sustainability from more of an economics perspective, I think,
Hmm.
um, because it was about, and infrastructural investments or and things like that, and the corporate social responsibility aspect. But I was very new to the topic, so I just learned a little bit from that industry and the economics perspective. But I was totally missing a social sciences kind of perspective on it. And I think most of the time the topic of sustainability is mainly understood in that kind of environmental and economic axis. That's mainly what people activate in their mind when they're talking about it, right? Because there's this goal that we have, that we want to, yeah, align our economic activities to sustain the environment and the future of the planet. And I think when I started studying anthropology, I realized that the topic of sustainability is so diverse. And I think that that has been my main focus since, is looking at sustainability more from a social sciences and cultural perspective, because the topic of sustainability is it's like a transversal concept, right? You can think about sustainability on any level, in any industry, in any region or context. There's just everything and anything can fall into that category. So it's really challenging to find a common language. And so when you say, you've had your own kind of like ambiguity or difficulty to contribute to the discussion, and I think that many, many people feel like that sustainability is a kind of a lofty ideal, and sometimes people talk about it like they're talking about the same thing, but it's not necessarily the case. So um, I think the challenge becomes evident when you look at how you negotiate, how you achieve the means of achieving
Hmm.
sustainability. And I think that is a huge area that has so many different ways of being looked at. And I think for me, the main finding is understanding the diversity of kind of values and life realities that are can make sustainability meaningful or less meaningful for different people. So, from an anthropological perspective, the topic of sustainability shows itself in so many different ways. And I think it's really important to keep an open mind because there's not a one size fits all solution. And sustainability really, this discourse on sustainability really needs to remain flexible and inclusive so that it can integrate different social cultural realities. Because otherwise it just becomes superficial.
Hmm. That's so well said. I mean, I think there's so many parallels between the world of sustainability and how we talk about it, and I also think with education because there are so many axes in which you can think of education through, whether it's education, whether it's policy, whether it's technology, whether it's philosophy, whether it's sociology, anthropology, history. I mean, it's endless. And so it, do you feel like your background in anthropology has really shaped your understanding and the way you think about sustainability? And if so, how?
Very much. I mean, there's so many things that I could be saying about this. Um, I think if I had to bring it down on two kind of pillars, I would say one interesting area is the the idea that there's cultures of sustainability. So there's different ways in how people express the concept of sustainability, kind of what is the meaning behind it? What are the assumptions that are there? What does that mean for the practical reality? And I think that there's so many different. I think that the culture of sustainability in Switzerland, probably you could analyze the kind of vocabulary that is always used to, the kind of storytelling that is referenced often in the topic of sustainability. And so you can see that this is it's not one clear understanding. It really depends where you're positioned also culturally and that kind of defines your perspective on it and whether you want to talk about it or not. I think what's really interesting, what I'm seeing in my research is as well, like some people don't really like to talk about sustainability because it has taken on a very specific cultural baggage. Sometimes it feels a little elitist, sometimes it feels a bit too academic. Um, some people see it as greenwashing. Um, there's a lack of trust in whether people are actually doing meaningful work with this topic. And what's interesting that I'm confronted with that too when people ask me what I do and I talk about the topic of sustainability, I can also feel people's kind of blank stare a little bit. But in my work and now the topic of sustainability, currently I've been mainly looking at how in the university context, as we go back to the topic of education, how is it talked about there? How do students talk about sustainability? What do they envision for academia, for the sciences, and also different scientists? So I interviewed 17 scientists from different disciplines and on the topic of sustainability. And I kept it very open on purpose to see what comes up. And so many different things came up. Some people talked more about how universities have to be more sustainable in an operational sense when it comes to flying and CO2 emissions. And then there were other people that had a very different perspective on the topic that were highlighting more sustainability from a psychological and cultural perspective, like how is the culture in academia sustainable as a way to work and live that can enhance better science. And so it's a very broad arena and originally the project had this kind of headline between activism and analysis to kind of show the broad spectrum of how people relate to the topic of sustainability from different perspectives, and even bringing in different temporal perspectives. Some people highlighting topics in sustainability that have to do with long-term transformations, like the publishing culture and how that is creating incentives for people to focus more on a certain way of doing science, other people discussing more short-term, topics. So it's a very broad landscape. And so it's understandable that it's not always clear what we talk about when we talk about sustainability. And so I think that my main learning is that we have to kind of talk about sustainability without using the word in some sense,
Hmm.
you know?
I really like the list that you gave. I couldn't write it all down, but you said greenwashing, the lack of trust, it's too highly academic. Do you remember the rest of that list that you
I
were
think I
kind of,
mentioned elitist.
hmm,
Yeah, because
elitist?
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I think all four of these are phenomenal, re different reasons to why that conversation brings up some sort of resentment or some sort of like, I am not a part of this conversation because I see that all the time. I mean, and I think so it happens, I mean, so often in the States, and often it's just put down as, these people are uneducated, or it's often put used as like a way to put people down rather than to understand, okay, there's enough people that feel this sort of resentment towards these conversations. Can we understand why? And so in these four things, I like how you talk about not using the word because the word itself might have so much baggage. How do you then bring up talking about the types of work that you're doing? Which sustainability is just pretty much, to me, what it means is just figuring out a way to coexist with the planet so we don't run out of all our resources, which I seems in my head seems to make sense. But then there is a whole bunch of politics that's thrown on it and a whole bunch of rules and regulations that people can disagree on. But how do you then talk about sustainability so it doesn't push people out of the conversation?
um, I when I in the interviews that I've had, I kind of might bring up the topic, but I kind of try to find more the narrative or the storytelling around change. So, how do people talk about change? How do people talk about transitioning from a current state, a current culture, a current inherited tradition? And how do they talk about something new that they want to, an ideal that they want to go towards? And I think that for me, the assumption is that and I try to look at that it kind of implicates sustainability. People are reflecting on how certain practices are are not sustainable for different reasons, whether it's for mental health or for just, ineffectiveness or absurdity or whatever that might be. And and they're trying to move towards something that feels like it might be better. Whether that is better, we don't know, right? But I think it's generally exploring narratives of change
Hmm.
and from a sociocultural perspective and so for example in the area of education in the topic of sustainability, it's now one of the topics that came up more and more is that people are transitioning from talking about how universities have to reduce their emissions as like a core responsibility, which of course they also do have. And, we structurally it takes time to adjust and for institutions to implement these strategies. But something that scientists and lecturers that I've been interviewing and talking to, and even students are bringing up more, is the topic of education, which you wouldn't necessarily relate to sustainability, right? You would think, okay, are we teaching about sustainability? Is that going to make more sustainable students and kind of people in the workforce? Um, but the topics there, I think, are a little bit more nuanced. It's a little bit it's not necessarily just teaching about, the world is going to end. It's about what kind of values also are being transmitted through learning. What do we value, and how does that reflect itself in teaching? And what are the generational differences in how what we used to value before? That's like, if I make an example, in like the natural sciences area, I talked to someone who's like does a PhD in chemistry, and we met at a workshop on innovation in teaching around sustainability. And they kind of expressed not being sure how that can work, because usually the culture there is that chemistry, like there's things that you have to learn, and there's not really a negotiation around discussions about what this means for sustainability. The curriculum is so packed, the expectations are so high. Teachers have their script, they just run through it, and there's not much kind of change that can happen there, right? And so they were talking about how in the previous generation, what was valued was someone who was so good at their specialization, right? The kind of, I don't know how to say in English, Fachkompetenz. It's like the the actual content of the studies, that was more important. And I think nowadays we're not valuing only individual genius in a specialized topic, but we're valuing people who are um, good at creating innovative teaching environments for students that integrate different perspectives, and that is a way that students are socialized as well. And so the institution of academia has a role in socializing students, and how is teaching expresses those values.
Hmm. I like this point that you brought up about actually addressing. I mean, it's yes, that's so true. I mean, I think even when I think about like English class, for example, I wish for every book that we had read, we also had a long conversation about why that book was selected. Not just because, this author is good, but why exactly does the government want us to read this book? Like that conversation, I think often can be far more interesting than the book itself. And I think that's the same thing with a lot of the things that you're talking about, where when you get to the values space, you can actually generalize past the particular content. And the content is important. But once you understand the reason why the content is being provided, then it actually makes sense how you go about learning it. And I think that's like what I'm hearing you say about a different form of understanding sustainability content rather than just like, this is how, then it would just become a form of brainwashing if the reason things were taught wasn't analyzed, right?
Exactly, yeah. And I think that in a way, the fact that sustainability is becoming important is kind of forcing us to reflect on these things. Like, what exactly are we trying to teach? What are we assuming will come out of it? Um, so yeah, I really like what you said about the kind of more like the context, like reflective perspective is super important. And yeah, right now I'm working for a project that's they're developing a bachelor in sustainability that is interdisciplinary, and it's also involving different universities. And so it's like a European kind of program that allows also mobility and the involvement of different kinds of um, lecturers and involvement of disciplines. And so here at the University of Zurich, the specialization track that they're offering is a social science perspective on sustainability, which is very needed to complement, the views of sustainability that more economics and environmentally perspective. Because in the end, it's a play of the whole. And so I'm curious to see how that will develop.
Hmm. A lot of what you've been talking about has been, it actually got me to this point, which I think is going to influence a lot of how I view I've been trying to postulate the importance of the humanities, and I've been talking to a lot of parents who like are in the tech space and don't really value the humanities. So I've been trying to figure out the most like convincing way to articulate the importance of the humanities. And I think this conversation helped me in that direction. One is when you take what the humanities offers a person is a particular lens in which they can analyze and understand the world around them. So if you studied history, for example, you would understand the world in a very specific way rather than someone who studied linguistics or anthropology or mathematics. And each subject gives you this really special lens. But once you combine that lens with a few technical skills or something that you can actually do in the industry, all of a sudden you've now created this like ability to understand and also to act and manifest whatever your ideas are, which is like kind of this like ideal place to be. But when somebody's trained just in the technical abilities to do something, they don't have the necessary ability to have like a powerful lens through which they can understand the world and also understand the ways in which their understanding might be flawed or biased or constricted to only a few perspectives. So I think in that way, when you talk about how anthropology has like directly impacted your technical abilities to work in the sustainability space, it's like a very clear kind of like how all your learning through your apprenticeship programs like gave you the technical skills and then all your intellectualization at the university gave you that the lens through which you can kind of combine those two and now be highly effective in the world. And that is a really unique kind of balance that unless you're able to navigate both of those worlds, like the intellectualization sphere and the technical, I can, do things with my hands and body and my mind, it's hard to kind of put those two worlds together.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what's really I think the core of at the heart of the challenges of sustainability is human behavior. And I think that one of the pitfalls of discourses of sustainability is this assumption that you have to just look at the problem, create a solution, and then you're one step further ahead. And in reality, human behavior is very complex, and how people live their everyday lives, the habits that they have, and how different spheres of human activity are interconnected, you know, um, is if you don't look at that, you're just trying to kind of integrate a solution and you just assume that it's going to be absorbed and then implemented when you look at it from a tech perspective. But I think it's really important to understand what is the context in which you are trying to deploy this solution, right? And
Mm,
how realistic is it that that solution, that policy, or that technology is going to be practiced in the way that you conceptualized it? Because if you don't include a proper understanding of the 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 social and the cultural realities of how people live in different places, if you don't study those. But nowadays, like there's a lot of anthropologists that working in product development or service development are being hired to do ethnographic research in different communities where maybe like medical technologies are being developed for specific demographics because they want to make sure that they're not wasting resources creating a solution that then won't be received. But yeah, so I think for me, one of the main topics of why I appreciate the social sciences is is appreciating the complexity of social situations and how people live their life, and that is just something that is a fact and can't just be supplanted by an ideal of how people should be behaving. And I
mm,
think that if we're not aware of that, that is actually unsustainable because we believe that the world will behave in a certain way um, based on just an ideal.
mm. Wow. Huh. I feel like if you look at this, I put all these notes down. I feel like you've been spitting. I know at the beginning you're like, I don't know
I
if
love
I
it.
can, I don't know if I can do it or not. But I feel like there's been so much wisdom that you've been spitting, and I wanted to kind of ask you some. I wanted to ask this earlier, but I was just very enchanted by the things that you were saying. But I want to play this last game to end the conversation. I want to kind of give you some particular so people always ask me like what's the favorite place you've ever been to, and I think that's too broad to answer that question because for every specific facet of life there's one place I think that does that aspect really well. So I'm going to just say like an aspect, and I would love for you to like think about all the different places you've been to and tell me like a place that really captures a particular place, a particular feeling or um, uh, aspect of life. Okay, so let's start with what is the place that you felt the most peaceful ever?
That's a very difficult question. Um, I mean, my first response is probably somewhere in nature, with a view. That's the first thing that comes to my mind. If I think about Switzerland, I'm thinking about a specific tea house, Japanese tea house that I really love, and that's kind of like um, a place I love to go to. It's in Ticino, so it's in Ascona on this mountain called Monte Verità, which has a really fascinating history itself. And there is a traditionally built Japanese tea house, and it's like a society of tea lovers that created it. They even have their own tea field that they harvest sometimes, and you can go there and have um, really high quality tea, and they have an outside patio with a view. And so I think that's one of the most peaceful places I've been to, just sitting there in front of wildflowers and seeing the lake, um,
Wow,
and sipping on a cup of tea.
that sounds really nice. If you had to pick a place where that you were the most excited to dance.
The most excited to dance.
Yeah.
I'm always excited to dance. Um, huh. I think it must probably have been some kind of forest party that was once a few years ago in Zurich. Some
Mm.
friends organized it. There were carpets, and they had like the city of Zurich gave them the green light to do it, to organize. And so that was pretty special.
What about your favorite food? Place with the best food you've ever had.
Best food. That's probably too
It's a
hard.
tough one. Yeah, that is a tough one. You got to really think about all the places you've been. It's a tough one.
Yeah.
Okay, that one's too tough. What about the last one? In all the languages that you've read, What's your what's your favorite language to read either literature or poetry in?
I think English, to be honest.
Really? Why is that?
Yeah. Um, when people ask me what my mother tongue is, of course, I say Swiss German because I grew up speaking mainly Swiss German with my mom, although sometimes we mixed it with a bit of French and Italian. Um, but English really became my heart language, I would say. So that's the language I have the widest vocabulary in, and I keep reading the most in English. So I feel like it resonates more personally.
Hmm.
But Italian is also a very beautiful language, also has some elegance to it.
Nice. Well, thank you. I feel like I really enjoyed this conversation, and I feel like there was so much to learn from when you started in talking about how education is a form of socialization, and we came all the way to talking about your work in anthropology and how, doing your um, apprenticeship kind of influenced how you ended up doing your intellectualization work in university and how that all impacted your work in sustainability and how we can kind of go about discussing these topics in a more inclusive way. I mean, there was so much to say, so thank you for all your insights.
Thank you so much. I loved the flow of the conversation. It was really organic. I thank you you really kept at it, asking the right questions. And so, yeah, thank you too for allowing me to share some of my experience and very personal thoughts. And I hope that the listeners will enjoy this podcast episode.
And that brings us to the end of our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you again for listening and making this process so much more enjoyable. If you haven't had the chance to already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts to get the latest updates on new episodes. If you've been learning useful information here, feel free to leave a review as well. A little bit goes a long way in spreading this podcast. And have a wonderful day. And as per usual, stay re-educated.